Now hear the word of the Lord from Luke 7, 1 through 17. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people, he returned to Capernaum. At that time, the highly valued slave of a Roman officer was sick and near death. When the officer heard about Jesus, he sent some respected Jewish elders to ask him to come and heal his slave. So they earnestly begged Jesus to help the man. "If anyone deserves your help, he does," they said, "for he loves the Jewish people and even built a synagogue for us." So Jesus went with them. Just before they arrived at the house, the officer sent some friends to say, "Lord, don't trouble yourself by coming to my home, for I am not worthy of such an honor. I am not even worthy to come and meet you. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. I know this because I am under the authority of my superior officers, and I have authority over my soldiers. I only need to say, 'Go,' and they go, or 'Come,' and they come. And if I say to my slaves, 'Do this,' they do it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. Turning to the crowd that was following him, he said, "I tell you, I haven't seen faith like this in all Israel." And when the officer's friends returned to his house, they found the slave completely healed. Soon after, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain, and a large crowd followed him. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. The young man who had died was a widow's only son, and a large crowd from the village was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. "Don't cry," he said. Then he walked over to the coffin and touched it, and the bearer stopped. "Young man," he said, "I tell you, get up." Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Great fear swept the crowd, and they praised God, saying, "A mighty prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people today." And the news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning, Sojourn. My name is Bobby. I'm one of the pastors here. Peace be with you. Here at Sojourn, we exist to reach people with the gospel and build them up as God's church, and then send them wherever God leads to be champions of truth, beauty, and goodness. Have you ever felt morally conflicted due to your job or due to any of your associations? Yes. Maybe you have an employer who donates millions to causes or politicians that you don't believe in. Or maybe they just make a product that is harmful, or they ruthlessly put little mom and pop stores out of business. Years ago, I worked for a law firm. I was a file clerk there. And this was a large law firm that had primarily a wealthy clientele, wealthy individuals and estates and major corporations. True story, one of the clients was Muhammad Ali. And this was a little bit before my time, but they still, everyone loved him. And he would come in and he would perform little magic tricks, like pull a quarter out of a secretary's ear, that sort of thing. They say he was just delightful. But their clients were people like that. They were wealthy people, and they were major U.S. corporations. And they primarily defended the interests of those major corporations and wealthy people against people like us, the little people. And so, as you might imagine, there were times where I felt morally conflicted working there. Some of the court cases were like, say, just some common person goes into a store, and it's a store owned by this major corporation, and something from a shelf falls and hits the person on the head, and they have to go to the hospital, and they have a concussion, and they miss work, and they get all these medical bills. Like, our firm would have been defending the store against that person. I had a friend that worked there, a supply clerk, and he felt the same sort of moral compromise working there. And he would sarcastically say, "Everybody else is trying to stick it to the man. We are trying to stick up for the man." And, somebody needs to defend the rich and the powerful. So that's where we were. At the same time, there were a lot of good people who worked there. A lot of attorneys who did pro bono work, free legal services for those who could not afford it, or for small charities. A lot of the clients, the wealthy individuals, put their money to good use in the community, trying to help people. The firm itself they would donate to Wayside Christian Mission and all these different organizations to help people. So it was complicated. Life is complicated. Do you know what that's like? If not, maybe you're just someone that feels invisible, unloved, vulnerable, voiceless, unimportant. Today's text gives us a story for those of you who are conflicted and those of you who feel voiceless. And as Luke often does, he gives us back-to-back stories that feature characters from both sexes. Not only both sexes, but they also feature a character from each of the two recognized groups of people in the New Testament period, Jews and Gentiles, Jews and non-Jewish people. And stories featuring the two main economic classes, the haves and the have-nots. There was not much of a middle class in this period of history. So let's see what Jesus says and does so we'll know his posture toward us and the posture that he wants to cultivate within us toward others. Luke chapter 7, verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people, he returned to Capernaum. At that time, the highly valued slave of a Roman officer was sick and near death. The Romans ruled the world. They had conquered Israel and every other place that Luke's audience knew about. And the followers of Jesus hoped that he would be the long-awaited heir to Israel's greatest king, David, who would reestablish the nation of Israel, the throne of David, throw off the yoke of Roman oppression, and usher in the beginning of the kingdom of God. This person would be the Messiah, which means the anointed one, the one who would set things to rights. This Roman officer was a centurion, someone who had command of 100 troops. And he is a highly valued slave. The world's economy ran on slave labor, and it was inconceivable to most people how it could be any other way. Just as inconceivable to many of the Jewish people was that the Jewish Messiah would come to the aid of a commander in the oppressor army and his slave. Verse 3, when the officer heard about Jesus, he sent some respected Jewish elders to ask him to come and heal his slave. So they earnestly begged Jesus to help the man. If anyone deserves your help, he does, they said, for he loves the Jewish people and even built a synagogue for us. Well, this complicates things. What if Iran could actually conquer the United States? There were actually Iranian troops on the ground throughout the U.S. enforcing Iranian law on us. What if there's a high-ranking Iranian commander who lives in New Albany? But he comes to love America. He comes to love the people of New Albany, and he refurbishes this church for us. This playground that we've been saving up years for, he just comes in and he gives us the best playground in the city of New Albany. He's still an Iranian army commander, though. Most synagogues in the first century were in homes, just like Christian churches. You've probably heard that churches in the New Testament period, they didn't have buildings like this. They didn't have buildings like the cathedrals that would be built hundreds and hundreds of years later. They met in houses or in apartments. Synagogues, Jewish synagogues, were the same way. Most of them in the first century met in houses. There were a few here and there that were actually standalone buildings, but that's the great majority were in houses. Somehow Capernaum, a village of 1,500 people, gets a standalone synagogue building. And it's nearly 5,000 square feet, which is huge by first century standards. Archaeologists just discovered this building in the 1980s. excavated beneath a later synagogue from the 3rd or 4th century. If you're the kind of person that geeks out over stuff like this, like me, 5 or 6 of you probably, if you look in the bulletin on your app, I put a link to an article about the discovery of this synagogue in Biblical Archaeology Review. So it tells all about this synagogue. This is a little bit of the layout behind. There's some other pictures in the article, and it tells how this came to be. Because there's only one piece of writing in the ancient world that tells us how a 1,500 resident village like Capernaum could have got a 5,000 square foot synagogue in the 1st century. And that ancient piece of writing is the Gospel of Luke. It is today's text. Luke tells us, how did they do it? How did Capernaum have a standalone synagogue? This guy, this Roman centurion, built it for them. And maybe Jesus does this guy solid, although it does seem still like a non-Messiah thing to do. On the other hand, Jesus doesn't just help those who deserve it. Jesus helps people who need help. So verse 6. So Jesus went with them. But just before they arrived at the house, the officer sent some friends to say, "Lord, don't trouble yourself by coming to my home. I am not worthy of such an honor. I am not even worthy to come and meet you. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. I know this because I am under the authority of my superior officers, and I have authority over my soldiers. I only need to say go, and they go, or come, and they come. And if I say to my slaves, do this, they do it." Or in the New Revised Gilles translation, game knows game. This centurion knows how the world works, power. And however much his worldview might be tainted, he believes that Jesus can wield this kind of power over sickness and disease and the unforeseen forces of this world that drive human suffering. He works for the bad guys, but he's kind of a good guy. What really matters, though, is that he recognizes something in Jesus on a deeper level than anyone else has so far. Verse 9, when Jesus heard this, he was amazed. Turning to the crowd that was following him, he said, "I tell you, I haven't seen faith like this in all Israel." And when the officer's friends returned to his house, they found the slave completely healed. So you can trust Jesus for your healing, even if you're rich. Even if you're a living contradiction of virtue and vice. Even if you're part of a system that has done great harm, which Jesus will eventually eradicate. Maybe at the end of the day, powerful people help powerful people. But then, verse 11, soon afterward, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain, and a large crowd followed him. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. The young man who had died was a widow's only son, and a large crowd from the village was with her. We don't even know where Nain was, although church tradition says it was 5 miles southeast of Nazareth. It's a little town that evidently left no trace. And this widow has lost her only son, which would be devastating from an emotional standpoint. But also consider the plight of a widow at this period of history. Some widows in the Roman Empire indeed had great wealth. They became benefactors who planned and financed building projects and were otherwise regarded as leading citizens of cities like Rome and Ephesus and Corinth. But most widows, especially in rural Galilee, were destitute, especially if they did not have children to provide for them. Her only son was her retirement plan. He was her Social Security. He was her Medicare. He was her Medicaid. And now he's dead, and in a lot of ways, she may as well be. Verse 13, when the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. Luke tells us nothing about this woman, certainly nothing about her faith. She doesn't cry out to Jesus. She may not even know who he is. Unlike the centurion who showed great faith, she seems helpless and hopeless. This phrase, his heart overflowed with compassion, is from a single Greek word which Luke also uses to describe the heartfelt response of the Good Samaritan to the wounded traveler and the heart response of the good father to his returning prodigal son. It's a word that means to be moved deep in your gut. It's visceral, from your deepest innards. Jesus feels her pain. He empathizes with her. Verse 14, then he walked over to the coffin and touched it, and the bearers stopped. "Young man," he said, "I tell you, get up." Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. Jesus touches the coffin, which would have made him ritually unclean according to Jewish law. He takes on our condition in order to deliver us from it. And this phrase, get up, is grammatically passive in the Greek. It's more like Jesus is saying, young man, God's about to get you up. And God does. Verse 16, great fear swept the crowd, and they praised God, saying, a mighty prophet has risen among us. Well, that's interesting. Why a prophet? Miracle worker, sure, but don't prophets just predict the future? There are certainly prophecies that foretell actions and consequences, but most often, prophet is what we think of as a preacher. But here, what these onlookers understand and what Luke wants his audience to see is that Jesus is demonstrating his continuity with mighty servants of God back in the Old Testament, particularly Elijah and Elisha in these two stories. There's a New Testament scholar named Diane Chen, and she writes this: the prophetic identity of Jesus is highlighted, making explicit the earlier comparison between him and Elijah and Elisha from back in chapter 4. Jesus' healing of the centurion's slave from a distance is reminiscent of the cleansing of Naaman from leprosy by Elisha, also from a distance. Naaman was also a commander in an enemy army. The raising of the dead son of the widow in Nain bears uncanny similarities to the account of Elijah bringing back to life the child of the widow of Zarephath. Jesus continues the story of God's loving pursuit of his waylaid and wayward creation, reprising and even surpassing earlier major figures in the history of redemption like Elijah and Elisha. It doesn't matter if you're like the powerful Roman centurion or the poor Jewish widow. Jesus somehow finds faith inside the oppressive Roman regime and feels compassion for rebellious Israel. And he still does this today as the story goes on. It doesn't matter who you are. Jesus invites us into a grateful kingdom response. First, we respond to what Jesus wants to do for us, and then what he wants to do in us for others. Many of us here in contemporary America are a lot like the Roman centurion. We have access to material comforts that most people in the history of the world could not even have dreamed of. And often, our comfort and consumer choice comes at the expense of those less fortunate. Some of us might feel more like the poor widow today. And in fact, in some ways, every single one of us goes through periods of our life where we feel like the Roman centurion or the poor widow in both good and bad ways. Some days I'm full of faith, and the next day I'm too low to ask for help. One day I'm conflicted by the choices and privileges I have that others don't. And the next day, I feel voiceless or powerless. Jesus loves me on both days. And some days I feel more like the centurion's slave or the widow's son. I can't get up. I need God to stand me up. And God has, God does, and God will. Not only for my sake, but so I can begin to become more like Jesus. So I can feel compassion on those that I'm eager to scorn or easy to overlook. So here's my Monday challenge for you. Something to begin doing tomorrow that you can do all this week. I invite you to pause, to once or many times a day and pray a breath prayer, which I will explain here in a second. This is something you can repeat as many times as you like. This is something you can do when you're driving your car, when you're in the shower, when you're in bed, when you're in line at the grocery store. You can do this over and over. Inhaling and exhaling and attuning to the presence of God and paying attention to what God might say to you. It works like this. Take a deep breath in, at least 4 seconds. Deep inhale. And as you inhale, you silently pray, Lord, help me love the Roman. And you take a big exhale, several seconds. And as you do this, you silently pray, Lord, help me love the widow. Inhale, exhale. Lord, help me love the Roman. Lord, help me love the widow. Whenever this pops into your head, whenever you have a few seconds, Lord, help me love the Roman. Lord, help me love the widow. The easy to overlook and the hard to love. And if you do this enough, you might find that eventually you mean it.